do you really want to be with someone who doesn't want to be with you? They want the person back, but what they really want, I think, is that fantasy they have of that perfect relationship or that perfect family, not the reality of it.
Right. And my ex and I laughed so much because when we informed our friends that we were getting divorced, and they said, "What? You guys are the couple that likes each other the most out of all of us."
Yeah, if you guys can't make it, what the heck does that mean for us?
This is Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered.
Hey, welcome to Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Today I'm hanging out with Susan Guthrie, retired divorce attorney and mediator. We chat about the do's and don'ts of this process and provide some insights, including from my own relatable experience with divorce. Well, hello, Susan. I am so excited to chat with you today. We were talking before we started recording that we've done a few different projects together, and it's always such a pleasure to hang out with you. So I'm excited to talk about normalizing divorce today.
Me too. And I'm so glad to be back here with you. I always enjoy having a chance to talk to you.
Well, thank you. Yes. So I want to talk about, and when I came on your podcast, we talked a lot about like navigating healthy divorce and what that looks like. And then even I think when you came on Calm, Cool, and Connected, we talked a similar conversation. And I definitely want to explore that, but probably a little more unfiltered, as that's what we do here. But I think first and foremost, just talking through the normalizing in terms of like, there is such a stigma, even 2023, there's such a stigma around divorce and what that means if you are divorced or you want to get divorced. And I think about so many clients that I sit with, and you probably the same throughout your career, who just have so much shame around it. And so when they come in to first bring it up, and it's like this topic that they haven't brought up to anyone, or maybe if they have, they tiptoe around it. They don't want to talk directly about it. What do you think that's about? Like from your experience, where does that kind of come from and how has it been perpetuated?
Yeah, and it's something I've been in the world of divorce, I guess I'll call it, for 33 years as a professional. And it's sadly one of the things that I would say has not changed much since I started practicing in 1990. The shame around the stigma around that word divorce is still as strong today for so many people. And I really think it's the way that society chooses to, and it's not just divorce and the end of a marriage, it's how society chooses to look at the end of something. And instead of valuing what it meant while it was intact, people tend to just focus on the negative of its ending. It may not always end well. Many people behave poorly, unfortunately, when relationships end, which I think is another symptom of the fact that we stigmatize it so much. Right. People don't sit down and have mature conversations about, you've been wonderful, I loved being with you, but it no longer serves me, and therefore it doesn't serve you. So unfortunately, I think it is really something that we struggle with as a society, and it's not well received for people to consider that not every relationship has to last forever to be a successful relationship.
Yeah, and that being so important that it can still be successful even when it ends. And a career was still successful. It was still a stepping stone, or it was still a season of your life. Or even sometimes we look at friendships or hobbies, volunteers, projects, all these different aspects of our life that we can accept maybe are not permanent. But truly, when it comes to marriage, it is so indoctrinated in us that it should last forever. Did a sex therapy informed training recently, and she was talking about how like we live so much longer, and we, there's all these other factors, and the reason that marriage even started to begin with, and there are so many factors that come into the reality of you're likely not going to want to be with somebody for 50 or 60 years, but for some reason we can't accept that as a society.
And we don't seem to want to, which is what I wonder about when, I talk on this topic. I get quite a bit of pushback. I put out a lot of messaging through my social media, and just I speak so often on divorce and this particular topic. And I always get pushback from people of, when you talk about divorce as if it's okay, you're normalizing divorce, and that's wrong, because then it means people aren't going to try as hard as they should to keep the relationship intact. And I think there's something almost punitive in that, because there's a mental space that people seem to have or want to impose on others of, you should just buckle down and try harder. Doesn't matter how you feel. You should just buckle down and try harder, or just stick it out for the kids, because you made them a commitment, because it's supposed to be forever, because this, because that. And I've been through divorce myself, but I've been through it with hundreds of other people. And, universally, people are happier on the other side of that process, as they are able to live and grow into being new, exploring new lives and new relationships. And I believe that's for both sides of the paradigm. It's not just the divorce seeker. It's often the person who perhaps felt abandoned in the relationship as well will look back and say that. So it really is an unfortunate thing that we aren't able to consider that for some people, maybe a lifelong mating, or whatever we want to call that, is the right thing. And for others, it may not be, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is really the operative phrase of that, is that it is okay. And does not mean you're defective. It does not mean there's something wrong with you because you're choosing that this situation is no longer working for you. And so commonly I like that you bring up that even the person who didn't want the divorce necessarily still ends up being okay, or ends up even maybe better on the other side. And that's a really important point, because when I talked with a lot of my clients about that, to a large extent, that becomes really unfair to that other person who wants to, it's really unfair to both of them, but for different reasons. But the person who is wanting to be in the relationship, they're not getting so often. They're not getting the love, the attention, the affection, the connection, the intimacy. They're not getting any of that, because the person who's wanting to leave is often so checked out, whether physically and or mentally, that it leaves them both with a lack of intimacy. But often it's so much fear that keeps people stuck. And so even, with the clients that you work with, what is most commonly the reason that people maybe are afraid of divorce? Like, what are some things that become barriers to moving forward?
That's such a good question. And I think for so many people, it is, at least at what I've seen, is that people become very invested in two things: their version of what the relationship is, which may or may not be the full picture of what that relationship is, just as you're pointing out, right? They're really not in a solid relationship if the other person is checked out. And they're very invested in the future that they see. And the one thing that divorce does for everybody is takes that future that you thought you had, the map that you see, and it leaves sort of an open page. It's a blank page for so many people, because you just don't know what the future will hold. There has to be that faith and hope that better things are coming for both of you. But that's scary. A blank page is, I think, scarier for most people than a page that's filled out with writing, even if it's not exactly maybe the novel you want to read.
Right. And that uncomfortable comfort zone, as I talk about so often, is, described as that place that the environment, the relationship, whatever it is, that we tend to complain about, we express discontentment around. We don't want to really necessarily be a part of it. And often, again, it's for the person who wants to leave or the person who wants to stay, but they're both not experiencing contentment in that dynamic. but they choose it anyway. And so they're not doing anything about it. So I don't want to be here, but I'm not going to do anything to change it. And it's exactly because of what you're describing. It's that fear of the unknown, because, as they say, the crazy you know is better than the crazy that you don't. And so a lot of people truly think that. Well, I agree.
Yes, in your field, so yes.
Yes. And I mean, you and I both know that is so not true, that there is intimacy and connection and safety, and there are relationships on the other side of it that can be so fulfilling. But the fear is a powerful, powerful force in those instances.
Yeah, fear is the number one emotion that, at least as a divorce attorney and mediator, that I experience in my clients, right? They are in that fight or flight, everything is falling apart around me. They absolutely cannot see that the blank page is an opportunity,
right?
As opposed to a negative. They see a big black hole, an abyss ahead of them of, loneliness or being alone, which to them are very often the same thing. And there's a lot of fear, I think, around that as well, of being alone. When someone has become very invested in being a part of a couple or a family, right? We are, I don't know how many times you've heard it, but I know I have heard, I just don't understand. We're the perfect family. Everybody looks at us as the perfect family. We're the ones in the neighborhood or the school or the whatever that, everyone's always like, oh, you have the perfect family. How can this be happening to us? And, one, is there even a perfect, what's a perfect family, or perfect, what is perfection? But, I've always said to people, I've said it back way before I was a divorce attorney, but just to your friend who's going through a breakup, right? And they're like, no, I just want them to come back. I don't even care what they, and you're like, do you really want to be with someone who doesn't want to be with you? Is that truly what you want for yourself? And they want the person back. But what they really want, I think, is that fantasy they have of that perfect relationship or that perfect family, not the reality of it.
Right. And my ex and I laugh so much because when we informed our friends that, I don't know if I've ever told you this story, we informed them that we were getting divorced, and they said, what? You guys are the couple that likes each other the most out of all of us.
Yeah. If you guys can't make it, what the heck does that mean for us?
Yeah. That was exactly it. The looks on their face of like, exactly that. Like, what does that mean for us? But, and our story, we have a very unique divorce, and we were like, yeah, you're right. And probably to this day, we like each other more than most married couples do. But I do think that our divorce probably helped with that. Like, we are able to show up for each other in a different way, in a way that we choose to show up for each other and to be a part of each other's life, because we are family. And that was something that was so important, that was not going to change for us, that we didn't have to not be a wonderful family just because we weren't married. But I also know, and I've done a couple episodes on that, of people have a really hard time accepting staying friends or staying in a relationship with their ex. And I'm aware that's not always possible. I don't try to, pretend like that can happen for everybody. But I believe that if more people even saw that as an option, like, just what a different world it would be. What a different, to just even think how much we're able to show up for each other and support each other day to day, and even co-parent so effectively because we chose intentionally to remain a family. I mean, it's just such a game changer.
Well, and think of the gift you're giving to anyone who's listening right now or watching right now in saying that it's an option, because you're 100% correct. And this goes back to, I think, society's norms. The norm is to hate your ex. The norm is to vilify them, to blame them, and to be a victim in many cases. They did this. I mean, as a divorce attorney, all I ever hear are stories of, oh, go to a cocktail party as a divorce attorney. All you're going to hear all night long are, oh, you're a divorce attorney. Let me tell you about my divorce. And then it will be usually 15 to 20 minutes of my ex did this, and then he did this, or she did that. And I just had that conversation not long ago. And it turned out that woman had been divorced for 27 years. 27 years, and she was still living it. Right. I expected it to be like last week, but you're saying that that's even a possibility is a gift to people in that then they know. And I will say, I agree with you. It may not be the thing that happens right away. Mm-hmm. It may be something you need some time and some space. But I think the key word that you said is that you're still family, and people become very focused on we're no longer family, right? You're ruining our family. I hear that very up. Your dad cheated on us, in that conversation to the children, and ruined our family, and we're not family anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that note, let's talk about some of these do's and don'ts, because some ways that people can navigate, and you're right. It's not always right away that people can be friends or be close and have that relationship. And it's definitely going to depend on the circumstances. It is going to depend on betrayal and behaviors that took place throughout that process, of course. But when we really think of it as a continuum, as is anything in life, it could still fall somewhere on there. But what are some common things that probably happen? Okay, let's even start from the beginning. Even the way somebody tells somebody that they want a divorce. What are some ways that are maybe less effective than others?
Well, I can tell you one that is not effective: drunk, because that is a big no-no. And it is one of the most common things that I hear. I had to have a couple of drinks to get my courage up, or I didn't mean to say it then, but a couple of margaritas in, I just couldn't hold it back. And that is honestly one of the absolute worst ways to have that conversation, to start things off. And I do want to say, to talk about don'ts, starting your divorce off on the wrong foot, whether it be telling your spouse the wrong way, other things that you can do to start it off on the wrong foot. It's really one of those things that's hard to recover from, because divorce tends to go downhill fast. So if you started off on the wrong foot, it's not impossible to recover. But I would say those first moments of starting the process, be it telling your spouse or deciding who to hire on your team or whatever that might be, though that can get out of your control very quickly, unless you put some thought into it.
Yeah. And a common thing that I see as a major don't is choosing to maybe have an affair or do something that's really painful, really hurtful, because they would rather be caught doing something of betrayal, something that would give that other person a reason to say they're leaving, than just say they want to leave. And I will add that to our list, along with drunk and having an affair, two definitely ineffective methods.
Ineffective, and basically setting yourself up for a horrible transition to the next phase of all of your lives, right? And that unfortunately, the affair is, I went back once and looked at my divorce files for a year. And this was probably 10 years ago in my practice, but I looked at each one of the files and just, made a little list. There was an infidelity or betrayal, or there wasn't. And 70% of the cases, one of the parties had cheated. And I mean in a sexual relationship outside the marriage. There are other kinds of infidelity that can be as devastating, or even more so, financial infidelity, other ways. But, that's 70% of people. And I think that is, so many people see the affair as the thing that broke the marriage. And unfortunately, the marriage was probably broken long before that. But people, because it's so hard to end that relationship because of all the things we talked about at the beginning, people will just coast in that, I call it roommate territory, just not involved really in and whether it be a sexual relationship or just the intimacy of true partnership, they coast in sort of that roommate space. And then someone's shocked when someone else finds, one of them finds someone else. So I see both sides of it, because I've had clients who have been both the betrayed and the betrayer. But it's the saddest way that I see people end their marriages.
Yeah. And when you're saying 70%, the first thing that comes to my mind is that 70% that found out, or 70% that admitted, so the percentage was probably closer to 90, or, it's like probably so much higher than that. And you're exactly right. That is so often what we see happen, is that it feels so impossible. And again, going back to the stigma, going back to the shame that is put on it. And so because this feels too overwhelming to hurt them, or, and I did a post recently on Instagram on all the reasons that people do stay, and very valid reasons. There are times when it's just not possible to leave. And I definitely get that. But that is most often then when we see these other factors come into play, when the intimacy is missing, and really understanding that a healthy, sustainable, fulfilling relationship requires companionship and eroticism. And when one and or the other are missing, I do believe that's when the affairs start to take place. These other factors start to come in. And so the idea is like, well, I'm just going to use this as a Band-Aid because I can't bring myself to leave. But that Band-Aid ends up like becoming this gaping hole that is, as you were saying earlier, makes it so much harder to come back from.
Yeah, well, and it's 100% right. And I've seen those instances where I've had very, I love your, the way you put this as, the eroticism as well as the companionship, because I have seen over and over couples who have the ultimate companion relationship. They absolutely love to spend time together, but the intimate part of their relationship has left the building for whatever reason. Right. And in those situations, it's sadder. I mean, it's even more devastating when those end, because there is that element of relationship still there. This is not a relationship that is 100% dead. They have so many things that bring them together, but you're right. Those two elements go together. And, the other problem with affairs is, by their nature, they're secrets, and secrets require lying. Right. Yeah. And so it's not just the fact that you slept with someone else. It's the 150 times you lied to your spouse about where you were going, what you were doing. Those are those things that people, it's the death by 1,000 cuts, right? So it's really incredibly difficult for people to come back from. And, as a therapist, I'm not saying anything to you that I think would be a surprise, but I wonder, at least, if people who were in that situation were able to be honest with their spouse about and have communication around what they felt was missing in the relationship, even if the companionship were there. But if they could have a real level of communication about that, I wonder what that would do to continue, to help that relationship continue, or maybe help both of them come to the realization that it's not going to continue. But instead, everybody stays quiet about that stuff. They don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, because it's hard to talk about. How do you tell your partner, I'm not physically attracted to you anymore, or I don't feel chemistry with you, or, I don't want to be intimate. Those things that are just so hard to say, and not wanting to hurt that other person. And so they end up hurting them that much worse, but thinking they're protecting them. Yeah. I mean, it definitely spirals very quickly. So what are some suggestions that you give, even just like maybe a couple do's of, yes. Okay. Obviously sit down, protected time, no one's around, have an open, honest conversation. Is there anything that's like out of the norm that comes to mind when you talk to people about how to present this in a way that does feel as safe and respectful as possible?
Yeah, I love that question. And I'll be honest, these tips come from my friend Kate Anthony, who this is kind of her wheelhouse, is helping people in that space of should I stay or should I go? And if go is the right thing, how to tell their spouse. And two things that she emphasizes that I think are really important are setting aside, as you said, that space to have this conversation, making sure it's private and all those things that it needs to be, but realizing two things. One, it is not that you're putting it out there that I think I want a divorce or I want a divorce. You have to agree with me. It's, I have made the decision that I want a divorce, or I'm going to get a divorce, or that our marriage is no longer, working for me and we need to divorce. It should be not presented as a, you can talk me out of this, because you're really opening a door just to a conversation you don't want to have and is not helpful. And you also have to limit that conversation, because the first thing that people do when they hear they're getting a divorce is they start to spin into, well, who's going to keep the house and what are we going to do with the kids? And I can't afford to pay alimony or whatever those are. And you have to say, those are really important and difficult questions, and we are going to have to deal with those. But for right now, we can put those for another date. I just want to, I want to make sure that we have some space to talk about the decision that's been made. And I think those are both such critical, and then the ability to separate. Well, the other person, give them some grace and dignity, to, and I mean that physically, like you go somewhere else so they can have some space. So they have a little grace and dignity in allowing them to absorb what has just been said.
Yeah, to process that. So that, it really sounds like addressing it with healthy boundary skills is what I'm hearing you say, because that is often, and when I talk with my clients about it, I've obviously had so many conversations around what does this conversation look like? And I love that suggestion. That's exactly what I say as well, that don't open it up to negotiation. Don't open it up to allowing them to tell you all the reasons this is a horrible idea, or all of those questions of what are we going to do? What about the kids? And that is just immediately going to sink in for you. That's going to exacerbate that shame and guilt that you already had to work so hard to try to get under control to even present this. So as soon as you give them an opening to shame and guilt you even more, there's a very good chance you're going to be backing out of that pretty quickly and then ending back up in the same cycle.
Yep. And it will continue. The people in that moment will promise, I'll change, we'll go to therapy, we'll do, whatever Dr. Liz told us to do, I'll do it this time, whatever those things are. And, that first conversation, the other thing I think people need to realize is it's the first conversation. But it is the first of many, many conversations. It's just like when you sit down, hopefully as parents, and speak to your children together and let them know what's happening with the family, that you realize you don't just tell your children once that a divorce is happening and then never speak of it again. This is an ongoing conversation that we need to have. And that just goes to that core of communication. Yes, it's hard. I mean, it's so hard to talk about these things. I sit in a mediation room all the time with a couple talking about these hard things, which I would, it's not therapy or even close, but there have to be elements that are similar, because I've got people, talking about energy. And it's hard to take in, but I can tell you it's in those conversations that they need to have to move through their process, that they come together, that they find the common ground, and they start to lay the bricks to that path of continuing to be a restructured family, like you talked about earlier.
Yeah. And that's such a good way to put it. That's exactly it. You are restructuring what was into what now can be, and can be healthy, and can be safe. I would suggest for people, when kids are involved, to even go to a therapist on your own leading up to it, to get some verbiage around that, and also to learn how to validate and provide empathy in those conversations. Because I talk to my clients about, when you talk to your kids about divorce, they're going to have a million questions as well. it's not always appropriate or necessary to answer every question or to answer every question in detail. Yes, we need to make sure they have the information they need to feel safe and secure and stable. But when they start asking intimate questions, or they start asking questions that there maybe are no answers to, that's when validation actually becomes most effective, because what's going on is they're afraid, they're anxious, and that's what's coming out in those moments. And so when you can validate their feeling and their experience versus feeling forced to answer the questions, that kind of protects you from saying something you might regret later, or saying something that changes and now you're just throwing them even more for a loop.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think that happens a lot for parents. And what you're pointing out here, I think, is so critical, is getting some support before you have that conversation with your children. As you try, there was just a study that came out. I can't remember where it was, but there was a poll of parents going into divorce, and people, they asked them, what's your biggest fear in going, out of the divorce? And 100% are very, very close to it was the effect this is going to have on my children. Right. Yeah. And both parents are united in that. That's across the board. They may not be united in how to make sure that, they protect their children, but every parent wants that. Yet again, because it's a difficult conversation, many will just blurt it out in the moment. And often overshare with their children. I've been, I've acted as counsel for minor children and as a guardian ad litem in cases. And it's a little heartbreaking at times what children have access to in their parents' lives. I agree with you. You can't just say, everything's fine, don't worry. They're not idiots. They know something's wrong, right? You can't make them nuts by telling them their reality is, that reality is different than their perceptions. But your kids probably don't need to know that mom cheated on me with the tennis instructor, your tennis instructor. Right? They probably don't. Although mom, it's always the tennis instructor or the golf pro or, the secretary or assistant. Although these days it's virtual assistant, so maybe not so much anymore. So.
that's making divorce rates go down a little bit. Yeah, we switch to that.
Yeah.
So the other big factor that comes up a lot is money, right? That is often one of the biggest. While I still think that my ex and I would have had a very amicable divorce anyway, we were blessed that we were able we make our own money, and we were able that was easy, and we, but that's not the case for a lot of people. And so money becomes such a source of conflict. Let's talk around like some do's and don'ts for that as well. And I guess I don't even have any direction to take that. So, what comes to mind for you when I say that?
Well, I think one of the first things that people need to do, because you're correct, we talked about fear being the most common emotion. Fear around money for both parties is absolutely right at the top of the list. And that's whether you have a breadwinner and a stay-at-home parent, or even often when you have two breadwinners, because reality, you don't need to be a Harvard trained economist to say that one amount of income, or this, the amount of income that was coming into the household split into two households now doesn't allow for the same lifestyle, right? Yep. You have to be in the uber wealthy ranges for that lifestyle to absolutely not be impacted. Right. And so people will go into divorce, one, without acknowledging that, right? Thinking, well, this is where fault will so often come up into it, because there's a mind pattern that people will go through. Well, this is your fault. You broke up the marriage. You cheated, to take our thread forward. And therefore, my life and the children's lives should not have to change at all. But you should go live in a hovel, under the bridge. And that's just that's not a reality of how the process works. It's not good for your children, right? To go have one of their parents living under a bridge. And it's not what will happen, but people become so very invested in that and unwilling to face that that's not reality, that they then are having to be dragged kicking and screaming through the entire divorce process which makes every step of it harder. And that's where that conflict cycle will start.
Yeah. And I see that so often, that money becomes this source of feeling justified, so if they felt betrayed, then if they feel like if they get more money, that's somehow going to make the betrayal less painful. Or the person who feels like they are the breadwinner, well, I'm the one who worked for it, and now I'm having to give it to you, without keeping in mind, like, okay, well, they were taking care of your children and your home and your food, and
Right.
like, it just becomes so illogical a lot of times, but feels so it's so self-righteous on both sides. And then what we see happen is, like you're saying, they start getting so emotional about it that now it turns into this divorce that's lasting months or years or whatever the case.
And costing a fortune. Costing
Right.
a fortune. All that money that you're arguing over ends up with the lawyers.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me how emotional money becomes in divorce. Like, that is really what I've noticed with my clients. What it boils down to is it is so tied in with emotion. If somebody feels like they've been wronged, if there's been an injustice, they fight for more money, thinking that's going to make it better.
Well, and it's such a good point. And I think, unfortunately, it's tied into our overarching litigation and legal system as to how we treat divorce, because it's treated as a lawsuit, right? It's treated as party A versus party B. Right. So think of a rear ender. Somebody rear ends you, oh, my neck, oh, my back. You take them to court and you've got injuries. They can't wave a magic wand and put you back into your physical space that you were in before the accident. So what do they give you? They give you money. Right. To make you whole, to make you better, to make up for the wrong they did you. Yeah. Well, our legal system takes your marital relationship and puts it in that same box, right? That same litigation box.
So right.
And so it's actually quite logical that people start looking at divorce and wrongs that have been done them as something that need to be compensated. Because that's how we deal with all other lawsuits.
And even from an emotional standpoint, as you're saying that takes me back to, so Richard and I, we went to the courthouse all 3 times, or however many times we had to go to do it. We went together every time, went and had breakfast after. I mean, we're just as weird as they come. And so, like, the whole thing was,
I love it.
We just did it together. But I do remember that when we were doing the paperwork, and it was like, party whatever to party
versus party B.
Yeah. And we were like, this is so yucky, because it just, then it's like, me versus you, which we were like, no, we're in it together, we're doing it together. But you're so right, I've never thought of it from that perspective. So money or otherwise, divorce is literally being set up as a me versus you out
right from the get-go. Right from the get-go. And there are states I want to point out, for lucky people who live in a certain few states in our country, they have added a process for people who have agreements, who are like you and your former spouse, who are going through that process as equals on equal footing, where neither party is designated as the petitioner or the plaintiff, the defendant, the respondent. Connecticut, where I practice, is one of those states, but it's rare. And so it's an unfortunate hangover, because you are untying a legal relationship. So there is a legal aspect to a divorce. But as you know, and I've learned in my many years of practice, it's so much more than an untangling of a legal relationship, right? And the emotional aspect of it, you're weaponizing the entire process by turning it into a lawsuit. That's why one of my biggest dues for anyone who's looking at divorce is just stay out of the legal system. You do not need to participate in that process at all, except to finalize the legal portion, which would be the termination of the legal status, and to approve your agreement. But you can go through mediation, you can go through a collaborative process. totally out of court. You can negotiate amongst yourselves at the kitchen table. You can, do whatever you go to divorce attorneys, but they never go to court. They just negotiate between them on your behalf. There are a myriad of different ways to go through this that don't involve treating it like somebody did a bad job on your roof and you're trying to get them to give you your money back.
Yeah, that's such a good insight. Do you have any do's off of the top of your head for dealing with the financial? I mean, I know every situation is so unique, but let's say even when there is maybe just such a discrepancy in what you think you should get versus what they should get. And I don't really know, from what angle to address this, but how do you often, when you mediate and things like that, how do you help them to kind of work through that?
Yeah, there's two ways, and they involve bringing in people who know what they're talking about when it comes to money. There's a professional out there, a designation called a certified divorce financial analyst. And they are professionals who are financial analysts who have had additional training to help people who are going with the particular issues of divorce. And I will often, when we are having those just, completely imbalanced conversations around money, or one of them has really unrealistic expectations, I will usually suggest either bringing in a neutral financial professional to sit with both of them and maybe have the come to Jesus, right? Like you're living $100,000 a year life and you're living $100,000 a year life. And after tax dollars between the two of you is $75,000. So let's all get on train knowing you're each going to live on, less than $100,000 life. Sometimes it takes that sort of professional. Often it's only one of them. And it's usually the spouse who's feeling that they were betrayed or wronged. Sometimes they need an individual support person to help them understand the finances. And that's, the good of plotting what they can do post-divorce with budgeting, et cetera. But it's also somebody who has to reality test for them. They don't do themselves any favors when you're unrealistic and think, oh, well, if I just go tell a judge my story, they'll see it my way and they're going to give me everything, because that isn't what will happen. And so, I look at every individual couple as to what support they need, but very often, yes, they do need someone beyond just their advocate who will often advocate for what they want, not what they're entitled to. And a mediator who's a neutral. Sometimes they need another step than that.
Yeah, that's great information. And yes, using your resources that are available to you to bring that logic, because as we were saying, it becomes so emotional. So bringing in that objective third party to bring logic to the situation. And, for both sides, also, again, getting the professional help that you need from a mental health professional, because that is, you have your feelings about being wronged, and then you have your feelings with the guilt and the shame. And that's what I see happen so often, is that the person feeling the guilt and the shame, they are struggling with maybe codependent behavior. And so they're willing to give up more than was necessary, or they're willing to let the process just continue to drag out because they don't want to say no. Or, there's so many things that they are trying to do to protect their own shame and guilt that actually just makes the situation prolonged and that much worse. And so that, I love what you're saying of bring in professionals who know what they're saying, they're doing, who don't have emotion attached to it, figure it out and move on with it.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that, because having a therapist, a coach, both people who can help you deal with your emotional content around it. It's making me think of the podcast episode you did on Divorce and Beyond. And you were talking about so often the wrongs we're feeling in our current relationship really have nothing to do with this relationship and stem from dad not paying enough attention to us as children, or whatever that is too. But that all comes up in this process because it's so primal, right? It brings all of that to the forefront and everybody's triggered. And you only harm yourself when you're making decisions and setting your expectations and moving through this process from that highly emotional place. My number one tip to anyone going through divorce is not to rush into any aspect of it, but to give yourself time to process, do research. I call it the grace of space. Don't push your spouse into running out and hiring the first attorney. Don't go out and hire the shark because you're mad. Give yourself some time to really make thoughtful decisions. And probably the first person you need to talk to is the therapist and or coach. Get those emotions under control.
Yes. Great information. And I think that is so true. And you offer so many insights, so much valuable free information from your Instagram I've had friends. So after we did yours, and then after you came on Calm, Cool, and Connected, I've had multiple friends that are like, oh my God, I started following her. It's just, you give so much good information. So I am very grateful for that. On that note, where can everyone find you? What is your Instagram, your website?
Absolutely. So the podcast is Divorce and Beyond. You can find it on all channels. And then on Instagram, it's Susan Guthrie, ESQ, and Divorce and Beyond. So it's both there, and it's divorceandbeyondpod.com. And thank you. And I have to tell you, same thing about your Instagram. I've been following you. That's how I found you originally, as I saw your fabulous Instagram. And your posts are just so much great information in there. So I love that your friends will admit they're following a divorce attorney, because most people are like, nope, don't want that in my feed.
Yeah. Well, when there's good information out there, yes, I guess that's good to go seek it out. But yeah, that's so funny. That actually makes sense. Like, I bet you have a lot of people consuming your content that don't follow you. That would probably make a lot of sense, right? Like,
well, people get very caught up in it's like the old days at the same cocktail parties. You'd hand your card to someone and they'd be like, oh, no, I'm not taking that home. Family and divorce law or whatever on the card. So yeah, that's why I have the one account that Susan Guthrie asks and doesn't really say anything that is divorce related. But Divorce and Beyond, about my podcast is I do have a lot of divorce related information, but my goal is to really delve into the beyond and to the emotion and to the really deeper part of this. The divorce itself is that finite little period of time in your life. You will get through that. But your life after, think about your life after. I know my life after, and I want that for everyone.
Yeah. And I love that. And also how your content is so relatable as well. So give her a follow, go check out her podcast. And Susan, thank you so much for hanging out. I really appreciate your time, your knowledge, your insights. You are just such a pleasure to be with. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Susan, for hanging out with me today and for helping to normalize divorce. And thank you all for hanging out on Relatable Relationships Unfiltered. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for my newsletter, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick.